As the wise already know, picking a main event winner is not about ability. All of the remaining players have that. Instead, it's about profiling or prejudice, depending on what side of the airport security line you're on. Anton Morgenstern is going to win the World Series of Poker. The only thing that will stop Morgenstern is an astonishing piece of bad luck. But Morgenstern doesn't seem the type to suffer from that kind of thing, at least not this week. Every attempt to jinx the man has failed completely. We've bigged him up endlessly, and all he does is prove us right. We never believe a word of what we say, and yet there's been no sign at all of any glitch or of fate dealing him a bad hand. Fate, it seems, is on his side. The poker gods have found their favorite. So that is a blog post entitled Why Anton Morgenstern Will Probably Win the Main Event, posted on the Poker Stars blog on July 14th, 2013 at 7:30 p.m. I am your host, East Coast Sam.
And I am your other host, Legend of Ben on Poker Stars, and welcome to the second part of our coverage on the 2013 World Series of Poker Main Event, covering days 6, 7, and the final table. It's funny because I remember this is when I was just getting back into the poker scene, television-wise, and I remember following some of the online blogs about the main event around this part of the main event. And we'll get to day 7 shortly, but for day 6, obviously, Morgenstern did have a decent-sized stack. Was not quite the chip leader at this point, but it definitely seemed like he was a lock to at least make the final table. But to your point, well made there for what we'll be discussing in this, covering episodes 13 through 24, the longest by far main event in this last sort of block of main events going back from 2013 to present day. And, we were both kind of down. I mean, I was very down really on the quality of the first half of this main event. Even though it did have that nostalgic factor because this was my first main event back to watching as a live viewer on ESPN, I do feel that 2013, the back half of this main event is better, but not enough to make up for the occasional monotony of the first half.
Well, we'll get into this in obviously quite a bit of detail, but yeah, I mean, I agree with you that the second half definitely does pick up. When we got our Poker Go account, I thought of 2 things that I wanted to see right away. First was Scotty Wynn's blow up, and the second was Anton Morgenstern. I just had to see that happen like right away as soon as we got the subscription. And that to me is definitely raises the quality of this up. We'll break that down in detail. But yeah, I'm with you that this is still overall a fairly weaker season, even though it has some moments here and there. We'll obviously talk about the final table in great detail, who we thought should have won that or not. But yeah, I'm with you that the first half had a couple moments here and there, but for the most part, it was just kind of disinteresting. Not too many exciting personalities came to the forefront. Very little of the people that we saw the final table, who made the final table this time, we actually saw sort of appear in the coverage. JC Tran got a few mentions, but that was really about it. So we'll be really talking in more detail about how these guys get characterized throughout these final episodes.
Yeah, and at this halfway point, the start of day 6, the main characters of sorts, it wavers. It's not quite as strong as, again, some of those past main events where they really kind of locked it onto one player, like a Phil Ivey or a Grinder. Guys like Carlos Mortensen, JC Tran, Yevgeny Timoshenko, definitely up there on the spotlight list there. And oddly enough, they are all at our featured table here to start day 6, as well as a couple other guys that are fairly prominent in the high roller scene. We also have Mr. Brian Caverman, who I remember watching on the 2018 One Drop live. That was kind of fun. Table 2, we get Steve G, who, again, was the sole remaining November 9er or Octo 9er from the year prior. So, again, that last one standing from the last final table, whether it was Joseph Chung or Steve G here, always kind of get that extra bump in screen presence.
Mm-hmm.
We have one lady left, Jackie Glazer from, I believe, Australia.
Yep.
At the featured table, and a couple of the guys. We do get Ryan Riess at table 2 also, and Chris Lindh, Lindh Sanity, and also Bruno Kawauch, who was in there a little bit in the back half of the 2012 main event. So we get a couple of pretty solid final tables and featured tables. And so I don't know. So what are your thoughts on how day 6 began?
Well, with day 6, Steve G, I'd say, is sort of maybe the main character of sort of the first half of the season, and that he's the sort of November 9er who seems to get the most coverage. He's the one, obviously, that remains and runs the deepest out of all of them. So it is kind of interesting to see him pop up here. But yeah, I mean, just overall in terms of day 6, it's definitely interesting to see how Steve G's style of play has changed from the previous year. He talks about how his path is pretty much identical to the way it was in the previous year, and that he wasn't super heavy on chips, but he was able to pick up some pots with some good bluffs. And he actually does, I think, a pretty decent job bluffing throughout day 6.
I actually think one of my favorite parts of the episode was Noah Schwartz. He's shown, the intro of his episode as the halfway point. They do a kind of a montage of the first half of the main event, which is kind of nice, I guess, if you weren't binging these. And he kind of gets a brief interview in the intro saying, I got these number of chips, so 68 players left, which is actually pretty low to start day 6, actually, so it's pretty impressive. Mm-hmm. He immediately loses 3 million chips to Jay Farber at the outer tables, kind of gets all tilty and swearing off to the camera with kings against Farber's aces. And then, so I found that the timing was pretty amusing. He was kind of calm, composed, confident, and then boom, complete turn of face at that big hand. And actually, Jay Farber gets a couple of pretty spot-worthy moments. He also, at one point, exposes his hand prematurely, which results in Noah Schwartz actually benefiting because Jared Jaffe pushes Farber off of the hand, and Farber gets kind of pissy at himself and vents at Jaffe for, if I didn't do that, he would have done that. And then he actually gets a 1-round penalty, a la Andras Korokno in 2012. So, again, for a main event that was pretty free of controversy or, floor man coming over or stuff like that, it was good to get one of those moments in early here on day 6.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely is an interesting moment. I mean, it was clearly an accident, Farber's thing. When we say that it's controversial, it wasn't like he was doing that to angle anybody. I think he was aware that it was an accident. He accepted the penalty, just sort of got it from the seat and left. So props to him for doing that. He was clearly upset. Yeah, I mean, that moment is definitely the highlight of this episode. In terms of everything else, yeah, I mean, Steve G pulls off a good bluff with Queen 10, which I thought was pretty good.
There was a pretty big hand with Timoshenko against Tabali, where Timoshenko has the nuts, and Tabali rivers a inferior full house and ends up calling off an extra 1.6 million on a 3-bet on the river for an 8 million chip pot, which puts Timoshenko into the chip lead, where we'll kind of stay for most of day 6, but then kind of drop off towards the end.
Right.
But, probably one of my favorite parts of this episode is we've talked about how we love the outro with the Best Day of My Life song, but we kind of get a use of Brett Ritchie's rap in the outro as well. And that was kind of fun because even though, again, I'm not a rap person, we've sort of torn apart Prahlad Freeman's rap. I kind of liked how they used that in the editing for that as the episode concluded. Well,
I got to say, I mean, I think Ritchie beats Prahlad. I think he's a better rapper than him.
And it's funny because I was listening to the rap at 2x speed, and I actually thought it sounded better at 2x speed than at 1x speed. So
me too.
If I recommend to our viewers, to our listeners, to listen to that rap at double speed, and it'll be better than the normal speed.
Yeah, I mean, with this episode, there's a couple little moments, but nothing that sort of stands out too heavily in my mind. We see Benefield win a hand with just ace high on the outer tables. So we're starting to see a little bit more of him. Benefield sort of talked up as, he was this great online player, and then he sort of retired from the game, and now here he is making a deep run. So it's sort of interesting to see him established, winning with ace high. Not that this is the first hand we've seen of him, but now we're starting to see a little bit more of what he's capable of doing. I mean, Farber in this episode, beside that hand, and we don't have a super good sense of how he plays. He's sort of hyped up as, the amateur of the sort of room. He's a nightclub and VIP sort of event organizer, which is interesting to think about. But I mean, we still don't have a good sense of who he is as a person, let alone how he really plays. We get a little bit of that sense, in that he accepts the penalty, gets up out of the table, a little bit more talkative than the other players we've seen, but nothing super yet.
No, and again, this episode it's a decent episode, but it definitely is better than the majority of the first half of the season. So
yeah,
also helps it out. And we do lose over a quarter of the field heading into episode 14, the next level, 30K, 60K blinds. This is probably among the most nostalgic episodes of this entire main event. I had a number of them in 2012, but for 2013, 2 hands in particular are super nostalgic for me. The first one being the epic tank fold by Carlos Mortensen against Jorn Walthouse as James Alexander kind of complains about it. The hand itself actually takes 9 minutes within the episode, the whole hand, not just the not the river tank. And so you can imagine it was, a decent chance a lot longer live. And, props to Carlos for making a good fold. But Alexander talking, again, he doesn't establish himself well at the table. He was only actually at the feature table for a fraction of this level. So I guess the table was pretty happy to see that. But I don't know. I mean, I think Mortensen was taking a pretty long time. I was really surprised because he's not the kind of guy we'd ever seen take that long to make one decision. Not that he had too many long hands in the first place this main event, but it takes up 9 minutes is almost a quarter of the whole episode, and especially with it goes to break a commercial break mid hand, and then the next commercial break is just a picture of him folding his king's face up. So it's like that whole block of the episode was dedicated to that one hand, basically.
Yeah, I mean, they really give it time to just, we hear the table talk. We hear a lot of great lines from Lon and Norm. They make reference to the infamous polar bear joke that Kevin Pollak, I'll say, tried to tell, be diplomatic. They mention, even Carlos Mortensen seems genuinely frustrated. He says, he turns to Alexander, who says, this is taking 15 minutes. And he goes, each minute for you has been 5 minutes. Like, he's talking to Alexander while Malthouse, give credit where credit is due, is just staring down at the felt, total poker face. But it's just interesting to see Mortensen actually get frustrated at Alexander. I mean, that has to play a role in why it took him so long, that he seemed to have been tilted a little bit. But yeah, he makes the right fold, and then we get the excellent photo of him folding pocket kings. His cards kind of go up like this for a moment, and the photographer just manages to get it right in time, so you see both kings, which is funny. And even after the hand's done, he's still trying to talk to the Malthouse and get a read on him. He's like, hearts, deuces, just still trying to get that read, which I think is great. Yeah, it is interesting that it takes so long, but I think it was a tough spot. He had raised to 135 pre-flop. Malthouse and Reed both called. Malthouse then let out on the flop for 215, and then on the turn made it 510. So, I mean, there was a lot of action before the bet of 975 on the river. So I think, I think it's important to just give some time to it.
Well, it's funny because we'll see a move in the main event edits to allow hands to span longer to show the full thought process of the full table talk. And this was by far the longest hand, I believe, any episode had for any one hand. And it might be eclipsed by a couple of Kasu fans here and there later on, but it was, again, it's Mortensen, so it's the last remaining main event champion still in the field. So I guess I was picking the right player to want to dedicate that screen time to. I didn't mind it. I thought it was, Alexander chirping in there was hilarious. And, and then the other hand I think is super nostalgic is the on table 2 actually between Mark Newhouse, who is with Chris Lynn and Kaplan, where a busy three-way action hand on the flop where Chris Lynn has bottom pair and a flush draw versus Newhouse's pocket aces and Kaplan's bottom set. And it's not even that. I mean, it's a pretty typical cooler. Newhouse makes a pretty good fold, folding out $1.5 million on the flop. But then Lynn goes to the crowd, spade, like spade, and then after he hits the spade, he goes hold. He raises the roof and then brings it down. And this is kind of the pot that takes Lynn's sanity into the upper echelons of the chip leaderboards. And it kind of, when I was, 20, 21 years old watching this in that summer, I was on Team Lindh for the rest of the main event coverage. That just for that one hand, I'm not sure why. I just was on in his camp for the rooting for him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 6 spot, and he's a personable guy. He's not as personable as a Marcel Lusk, for instance, but he's shown to have a bit of personality throughout the coverage, so it's definitely easy to root for him. Yeah, I mean, that was a fun hand to watch. Good.
Now, this kind of ends up being a Mortensen and JC Tran focused episode.
Right.
Nothing, A+ material, but very solid, and again, above that standard that the previous, dozen episodes have kind of set. And at the outer tables, while we do lose Noah Schwartz finally, after he was kind of low on the chip count after the last episode, we get the return of the Rep Porter River Special.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, that the second of maybe like 4 or 5, like a miracle 2 outers he'll hit. So props to Rep Porter for running good. This was Mark Newhouse's 2013 debut. Everybody else by this point, I think, had pretty much popped up here and there. I think he was the last one to kind of be on screen for a hand or next to a hand. And by episode's end, we go down to 43 players. So, a good, almost half of the field gone within the first 2 levels of day 6. Things will kind of slow down with the eliminations per level, but going into the back half of episode 15, again, they keep the same tables, table 1, table 2, which surprised me because we saw how fluctuating the tables were on day 6 in the previous main event. So that was nice that we had some consistency there. Jaffe jumps from the outer tables to join the featured table in this episode. And again, a pretty stacked table. We have, still Mortensen, Kaberman, Glazer, Timoshenko, Tran. Waldhaus had a lot of chips at one point, became to kind of fall off around here. But again, a couple of pretty good tables, I would say. And also Phil Mater in on table 2. So, we're kind of coming full circle of all the characters and players that had been relevant up until this point.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Jaffe, who, up till this point has been a pretty impeccable player, but man, very sick hand with ace-king versus aces against Reed. Reed raises it to 160 with aces. Jaffe has ace-king, makes it 450. Reed raises Jaffe to 900. Jaffe 4-bets to 175. And then Reed shoves and Jaffe calls. I mean, that's just such a sick spot. I mean, you got to fold the ace-king there. And then the next hand that they show in the coverage, he busts with king-queen to ace-king. Just crazy to see, almost a bit of misdirection too, because they have this interview segment right before these hands where he's talking about pace and rhythm and how you need to find the right spots. And then just like that, aces against ace-king. So very interesting in the edit how they do that misdirection, but it's still sick to see Jaffe, who again, up till this point has been characterized so well as such a consistent player, go down.
Well, I mean, he had this reputation of being this aggressive player. In the earlier hands we had seen him on day 5, he always had a hand.
Right.
Even here, he does technically have some solid starting hands, and it just goes to show you how quickly in the main event, and even when you have a decent-sized stack, as those days go on, you have to just keep up pace. Otherwise, you're going to be exposed to 1 or 2 bad hands in a row, and then you're out in your ass.
Quite right. Yeah.
There are some pretty big eliminations in this episode. We do lose a Phil Mater, Somar Aldarwich, who way back on day 3 was the recipient of 800,000 chips, a la Mark Kroon. He has a couple of micro stack all-ins, which maybe got him a couple of spots higher up on the rankings. Maybe not a pay jump, but it's a little bit further into today's before he busts. We haven't really discussed too many of the bits because they're kind of ho-hum, but we got in the previous episode the calling the clock interview bit where everyone kind of says how long they wait to call the clock or what their rules are. I like Daniel Negreanu's stance on it. He kind of gives you one shot at not being called the clock in a hand, and then after that he'll put you on the clock after a couple minutes. I think that's a fair way of putting it because there's always going to be that one spot, that one outlier. The fastest player in the world will have to at some point tank, and I think that's a good policy. I was okay with that take on that.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said before, I don't mind a shot clock that's 2 minutes long. I feel like 2 minutes is a fair amount of time to give somebody who's faced with a regular decision, and then maybe have like a 1 or 2 minute extension every now and again for a player that's in a tough spot. Yeah, I mean, I think Daniel Negreanu is totally fair. I mean, it's interesting that he mentioned, I think it was 2014 was the Rettenmeier versus Seaver hand where Rettenmeier tanked for so long. And he mentioned during that hand, they usually waited 8 minutes before calling the clock, I think. So it's interesting to sort of see his policies change through time.
Well, I would say the main event is 2-hour levels. The one drop is a turbo tournament, I think maybe every 45 minutes or something like that. So that does kind of change. Maybe you have to account for that when you're deciding the ratio of the level, the structure size with how long you're going to let someone think over it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you got to weigh in all those factors. But the side action in episode 15 is bowling with Mike Matusow squaring off against Norman Chad.
Yeah,
I thought it was okay. I thought it was fine. I mean, this is pre health crisis Matusow where he's actually able to walk and bowl and stuff. So it's kind of weird to see him like that. But it was fine for a side action thing. I mean, I side action was probably my favorite bit from the 2013 main event. So this was in line with that quality of those bits.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny to see Matusow throw 4 straight gutter balls. Like I'm no expert at bowling or anything, but it gives me comfort to know that I could beat Mike Matusow in a bowling game.
Yeah, and it was kind of funny. I mean, this episode is pretty unflashy, but I think it was pretty solid. Some
Yeah.
Actually, one of my more amusing side notes on table 2 was this player named Prager who, at one point actually, praises his, favorite, talks to the dealer saying, "You're my favorite dealer," and then all of a sudden finds himself on the end of a kings against aces against Chris Lynn situation. So that's pretty funny, the timing of how that worked out.
Yeah, that is funny. Yeah.
And so again, 3, decent episodes for day 6. I mean, nothing groundbreaking, no crazy viral moments, but solid stuff. Considering the bar was kind of low for the main event up until this point for us. The concluding section of day 6 is going down from the final 4 tables down to the final 3 tables. The classic 27 left for day 7. And again, we get the same 2 tables. We get somehow, even though the field gets cut in half, more than half on day 6, we had the same 2 tables. So that was good to see. I don't really have much to say on table 1 for this episode. It wasn't really the focus of the, for me, as far as the entertainment value. Glazier kind of hangs on. She was kind of riding the wave of getting a little bit short, doubling up, going back down, doubling up again, so that eventually those streaks will come to an end. You can only win so many flips before you lose one. And but I did feel like you could feel the tension at the table as they're winding down on day 6. Everyone's just, they know that they're approaching the last couple of hurdles before the November 9, and so that energy definitely translated through the screen towards me.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite quotes from Alexander is he's talking to, I think, somebody on his rail, and he says, "All that money up there is consolation prizes. We're playing for $8.3 million." I mean, I love that quote. It just really summarizes where they're at this point in the tournament with, fewer than 4 tables left.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really like it a lot. Yeah, I mean, we get a little bit more sort of table talk in terms of character development. We learn a little bit about Tran and his family. We see him cooking pancakes at home, which I thought was adorable.
Yeah.
Him talking about that he wanted to cut back on being on the road and spend more time with his family, which I think is very sweet, gives us a little bit more of his sense of character. But still, I mean, by this point in the coverage, I mean, besides seeing, we see Benefield play a few hands, we've seen Farber play a few hands, we really still don't have a sense of really anybody in terms of their personality besides Tran, even though it is nice to see a little bit of that development. I wish they'd done a little bit more across day 6, the third last day of the coverage, really just sort of showing us who these guys were.
Yeah, there's 2 sides of that coin. There's the knowing these players through their poker style, and then there's obviously then their table talk or any sort of interview bits or segments, filmed elsewhere than the casino. And it did seem like up until this point, the focus was less on the November 9ers to do that and more on just whoever they can get a hold of, Phil Mader, Carlos Mortensen to a lesser extent. I mean, Tran, obviously, yes, you mentioned we do see his family life. But again, that's very nice. He's definitely kind of the de facto main character of sorts.
Yeah.
Impressionistically on me. But there's a couple of okay hands in this hand. There's a kind of a weird dealer error where the deck kind of falls out of the dealer's hand at one point, and they actually show a replay of it happening, which is kind of bizarre. You wonder, it's not football where the replay. Oh, let's see where the cards landed. And then the Rep Porter 2 outer special returns again on the outer tables. Again, always amusing. Bruno Kawauchi makes a kind of a bizarre flush fold against Chris Lynn. He floats the flush draw, hits the flush, and then folds it. It was, kind of a bizarre fold, but I mean, obviously he survived his episode, so can't whine too much about it. But oddly enough, Anton Morgenstern really, even though he ascends to the chip lead, doesn't really. We don't really see his ascension until we see him win one hand towards the end. But the majority of his 22 million chips he accumulates by the end of day 6, we don't really see that rise, which would have been great because then we can watch the rise and fall kind of give both equal amount of the hill up and the hill down in the spotlight. But again, we do see a little bit more of guys like Sylvain Loosely, Brimmelhouse, and a couple other players here and there. So again, as we're rounding the gears here to wind down for the final stretch episodes. Again, it is a solid episode, I guess. B minus, nothing crazy. Obviously, Glazier not lasting as well as Gail Bowman and Elizabeth Hill did 2012, but still a solid final last woman standing effort for her.
Yeah, I mean, seeing the interview, the bust out interview where she's sort of on the verge of tears and she's talking about how disappointed she is. I mean, getting 31st, that's great. I mean, in a tournament of more than 6,000 people, better than I could, possibly imagine. It's just sort of, that to me was the emotional highlight of the episode, was just seeing that. It's like, oh, it's just heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. And as day 6 concludes, Anton Morgenstern way ahead in 22 million first place land. And surprisingly, 2 of our eventual October number 9ers are in 25th and 27th, House and Benefield in 25th and 27th, respectively. And so, again, very impressive whenever you see that sort of trend of those bottom couple of stacks managing to maneuver the final 27 and getting to the final 9, despite that handicap at the start.
Yeah, and Riess only has 3.8 million. I mean, he's not doing too well in terms of chips either. I mean, Tran's got 12 million, Loosely's got 14. Nobody's super chip healthy, really. It's just very interesting to see that dynamic. I mean, Benefield is 27th of 27. I mean, what must he have been thinking going into day 7? I mean, wow, can only imagine.
Oh, I mean, he'll be used to being in last place at a table to start off a tournament, but again, we're going to get into day 7 next, which, much like 2012, gets broken into 6 episodes rather than the usual 4. And for me, these are really kind of the meat of this set of 12 episodes.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, day 6 was perfectly fine. Nothing, earth-shattering. Day 7, I'm not going to call it earth-shattering either, but I think it has a couple of plot lines that are so strong, it kind of makes up for maybe the monotony or repetition of everything else going around it.
Absolutely.
With episode 17, 3 tables of 9, obviously, we get, again, every table is going to have somebody we've come to see up until this point and this actually will break some formula where the number of episodes dedicated to what portion of day 7 is far more, because there's just so much action that is so clustered into one, stretch of time.
Right.
So to start off with, we begin with the blind at 60K, 120K. Morgenstern at table 1, along with guys like Steve G, Newhouse, Farber, JC Tran. They're all together at the first table. And that is really the meat of day 7 is table 1 during when there's 3 tables left, if you ask me.
Yeah, I mean, it's right off the bat. I mean, we just get so much interesting stuff. We didn't mention this, but Alex Livingston, who eventually would place 3rd place, and Benjamin Pollock, who would also place in 3rd place, both managed to have deep runs. Both of them managed to make the final 3 tables, and both of them did fairly well for themselves. I'd say they acquitted themselves well in terms of poker playing. We see Livingston up against Etienne McLaughlin. We see Pollock up against Coleman. He actually manages to bust Coleman in 27th place. So we get a lot of action right off the start. And we get some good sort of table talk mixed in there. We see Farber talking a little bit. We see JC Tran sort of messing with other players, even explicitly saying that he was messing with them. And we finally get some interviews with some of the other players, November 9ers, that we haven't seen. We hear Amir Leavot talking about how he used to be a chess champion, and now he's transitioning to poker, and it sort of engages in a similar strategic intelligence, but he now needs to think about psychology. And, that's sort of very interesting in terms to think about, like, how does chess and poker compare to each other? I mean, you're going, in a chess scenario, your head's up against somebody else, whereas you're at a poker table with 8 other players. You have to think about so many other factors. We see him, do relatively well for himself, folding a set against Reed's flush. Pretty good, in my opinion. Yeah, I mean, we're starting to sort of really get a sense of who all these players are, how they play at the table, and they all acquit themselves fairly well.
I think this is a stronger iteration of part 1 of day 7 compared to the equivalent in 2012. And unlike, past main events, we have actually a pretty equal distribution of what bust-out numbers of bust-outs come from what table. So part 1 of day 7 has 1 bust-out across all 3 tables. So they all go on to 8-handed play uniformly. And compared to when, one table has so many more chips at it, so there's more, chaos there, and one table kind of shrugs along, and there's just an unequal distribution of action everywhere. So that was kind of cool. So, and Morgenstern actually chips up. He begins 22 million, hits 25 million.
Yeah.
As 24 players remain. And another bit I kind of liked was Chris Lindh going over this dress prop bet he lost with his friends, where he had to wear a dress at a. And again, it kind of a silly looking frat boy fraternity goofball kind of thing, but again, kind of funny to see that shown in a side segment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Part 2 of day 7 continues that same level structure, 60K, 120K, gets into the 80K to 160K, brings us from 24 players down to 21. And once again, one elimination across all 3 of the remaining tables. Morgenstern, again, runaway first place chip leader. Alexander, kind of in that 3rd place slot, kind of had emerged despite being a short stack at one point on day 6. He was on this run to kind of get up into the upper, 3 or 4 slots in the leaderboard. But before we talk about the other tables, I just gotta say, Steve G, great guy, I'm sure, but is that not the worst all-in declaration you've ever heard in your entire life?
All in?
I mean, he's going all in with a shaky voice against the chip leader who has like 10 times his chips, who just re-raised him pre-flop. I don't understand what that raise is meant to accomplish. You really think, or even if Morgenstern raised him light, he's probably going to call him anyway. I mean, 10-7 suited, 24 players left in the main event.
The only guess I had is that he figured suited connectors, I've got 2 live cards. Okay, you're up against ace king, you're like, what, 30, 40%? I don't know. It's a weird spot. Could have waited.
Dave Farber at the table has got his hand in his head like, oh. I feel bad for him. And Farber was a guy who had actually had a pretty bad first level.
Yeah.
It will be mentioned by his rail kind of later, but, even he's feeling bad for Steve G. Clearly had some respect there for him. And so Anton reaches the 29 million threshold with the elimination of Steve G. So now there's 23 players left. Morgenstern has like 1.5 the chip average of what the final table chip average would be. So again, that puts him in a great spot because he's going to be able to change his game up, slow things down, control pot sizes, and maintain his stack, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, if I had 30 million chips with in this situation, I'm tightening up, and I'm gonna make sure that I'm not gonna make a mistake when I have a really good chance of winning this whole thing.
Yeah, but before we move on, I mean, I just want to say, in terms of Jay Farber, we mentioned earlier him, exposing his hand before he was supposed to. We get this very unusual moment where he's in a hand with loosely, and there's a player that I think busted, and so everyone's sort of applauding, and he claps, but he doesn't clap like this, or he claps by like tapping the table like this, which traditionally is a check, but he immediately pauses and goes, oh, no, I didn't mean to check, I was just clapping. He was actually allowed to make a bet. They let the action stood, and nobody seemed angered about it, but I just thought it was a really odd moment that they just sort of rolled with it. Yeah, it's very strange.
Yeah, I mean, he was trying to do like a minimalistic, acknowledgement of elimination. I think it was a tripity on table 2. And so, I guess maybe they believed him, so they didn't really worry about it. But yeah, it was an odd choice considering how rigid those tournament directors can be sometimes when it comes to following the rules, word for word.
Yeah.
So again, Tripoli bus. We didn't really know him, so it wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, he was eliminated off screen. Unless you want to count that little Jay Farber moment as being acknowledged on screen, because pretty typically the whole idea of day 7, you have 6 episodes, you're going to be able to see every single hand, or at least the majority of the action part of each hand. That was kind of an odd choice. We don't really get a ton of table 3 in this episode, but Timoshenko was kind of fading slowly and surely as the day 6 and day 7s wore on. So he gets kind of this unglamorous sort of bust out as one of the short stacks. Kind of a shame. I mean, he was kind of a nice guy to follow up until this point, but we lose him. And again, it's not a particularly important episode. We do see the start of the Anton Morgenstern downswing. He loses a couple of hands, one to JC Train, which I don't really blame him too much for. I mean, he had top pair on a double paired board, but so he loses about $2.5 million on that hand. So nothing monumental. That's less than 10% of his monster stack against JC Train, who was the second biggest stack at the table, if not the room, or certainly up there. So, you're going to play a bigger part of number two sometimes. And then he kind of overplays a 5-4 suited against Jay Farber. Doesn't lose a ton, but loses, 5 or 6 big blinds. And so, again, kind of the teetering on the start of that sort of decline of Morgenstern, but he's still riding a high as the episode ends.
Yeah, I mean, they don't call too much attention to it in the edit. So this is sort of something that obviously we know what happens to Morgenstern at the end that we would only pick up on in retrospect. He still has something like 24.5 million as the episode ends. Lindh is at 17 million. So, I mean, Lindh's still comfortable, but I mean, there's a 7 million chip gap between first and second place. Morgenstern by far is, the player to beat at this point. I mean, we see Mortensen, he's still in the mix, he's playing okay. We see sort of Farber starting to chip up a little bit, but yeah, I mean, still the runaway chip leader is Mortensen.
I kind of compare Mortensen's day 7 to Elizabeth Hill in 2012, where they make it very far into the day, but they kind of stay in that, 7 to 12 million chip range, where they're never short, they're never a big chip leader. And then it just takes a couple of hands as the day ends for them to kind of be down enough where they have to, put it in kind of with a short stack of, mediocre cards. Mm-hmm. And again, both of them play very solid. We see them both win more hands than they lose. But that's just kind of my comparison. If you're going to compare, the previous year to this year's main event, correlating those two together.
Yeah, I mean, Mortensen ends the episode with 9 million in chips. The virtual final table, Kawadi has 9.3 million. So he's still in the mix very much.
Yeah. And episode 19, the third part of day 7, as they're concluding the 80K, 160K level, they'll go into the 100K, 200K level with 21 players left. So again, Anton Morgenstern, big chip leader, 21 left. James Alexander, kind of the chip leader of sorts on the third table. And Chris Lynn is the kind of the chip leader on table 2. And this is kind of that episode. It's like a story episode of a long-running drama where you've gotten to know these characters for long enough that when something bad happens to them, it really kind of hits you harder than if it was just whatever, some one-off episode. So the fall of Anton Morgenstern really kind of swings into, so you're dancing because this is just the juiciest stuff. This episode is so full of the downswing of the chip leaders that it results in a lot of those medium to low medium stacks to rise. And so with that chip swapping, this is the first episode in main event history with 0 eliminations.
Yeah.
This might be the only time that'll ever be the case. I mean, I could be proven wrong, but it's pretty wild. And it's just, the theme is chip leaders lose big chunks.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an absolutely crazy episode. I mean, I was focused on Morgenstern, and we were talking about this season, before we started filming, and you brought up the point that Alexander too had a very big stack, doesn't make it till the end, loses a lot of pots in this episode. Lindh also has a pretty big stack, loses a lot of pots in this episode. I mean, I'm so focused on Morgenstern that I forget about these other stories. And this episode, I mean, to use an analogy to Squid Game, this is the marbles episode from Squid Game in WSOP Main Event this season. I mean, it's such a crazy episode. And right off the bat, I mean, it's, again, this excellent little misdirection. They start with Morgenstern, they have an opening montage. He's the player to beat. He talks about how he's feeling good. He's not being intimidated by anybody. And then just that first hand with Morgenstern having 8-7 and loosely has pocket aces. And, it's sort of an aggressive chip leader move. It's not super egregious. You know, 8-7 is playable after the flop. But, you know, one of my favorite all-time lines from Norm is when he goes, if Anton does that 5 more times, goodbye. Such a good way to set this up.
He puts in like a 5 bet with 8-7,
Mm-hmm.
and it costs him about 3.8 million chips of his 24 million. So again, okay, I made an oopsie. You lost 4 million chips. Okay, you have 20 million chips still. You're still okay. Okay, let's move on. But then he loses a big chunk in a very another hand against Mark Newhouse, who in a coin flip. So you know, I guess you can't really say that Morgenstern made a mistake there.
Yeah.
But he loses about a quarter of his chips, if not a little bit more, with pocket eights against Mark Newhouse's ace queen when an ace had already been folded. So really, the coin was favoring Morgenstern pre-flop.
Right.
This episode kind of has what I like to call tired Newhouse eyes, where you kind of like when you're like falling asleep and you kind of like move your eyes up to kind of keep them awake. Like he does that a couple of times in this episode, and I really related to them because me being a former student in school for many early morning classes, I did the same thing where I'd be trying to just stretch your eyes super open to keep them awake, keep yourself awake, and again. With that loss, Anton drops down to that 15, 16 million chip mark, which again, still a lot of chips, not the chip leader, but within the confines of one level, like 2 hours of play, he's lost half his chips when he was the runaway chip leader. And so that's bad, but we've seen players like in before lose chunks and still kind of rebound and fix things up and turn things around. So no reason to think that he wouldn't be able to turn it around a little bit, right?
Yeah, of course. And in between these two hands, we have Lindh mixing up with pocket sevens against Livingston, who has pocket fives. And then Livingston manages to get one over on Lindh. And so Lindh starts to drop it down a little bit. Again, nothing too egregious, nothing too bad. Just sort of one of those pocket pair versus pocket pair situations. Pocket sevens, that's just a tricky hand to play. Especially post-flop when you don't connect with the board that well. So no big deal, but, we're sort of starting to see the downfall here, a little bit of Lindh.
Yeah, and while we do see plenty of downfalls, we do see the upfall or the upswing of Mr. Mark Etienne McLaughlin. He makes a pretty crazy play of 7-3 suited against Ryan Riess's pocket jacks, which ends up making a flush that picks off a bluff by Ryan Riess, who can only say, good call. So good call, which really cripples Riess down to only about 2 million chips. And so again, you're looking at 21 players left. Ryan Riess, our eventual champion, spoiler alert, will rebound and ascend the chip leader, ascend the chip counts, despite this pretty substantial chip disadvantage at a table that had a pretty sizable number of chips. I'm not going to say wasn't the I think table 1 by far the most chips at it, but
yeah,
table 2 was still, a situation you didn't want to be down to only about, 10 big blinds or whatever it was.
Yeah, and speaking of Riess, he does manage to double up with ace queen versus Lindh with ace 10. Again, not a horrible play from Lindh. I don't know, maybe you can get away from that. But, we're starting to finally see Riess a little bit. We have a bit of a segment from where he's talking about how he wants to stay focused, even though he's being hit up on Facebook and his sort of life is blowing up, which, I think maybe spoils his results a little bit that he makes the final 9. Like, I don't know if somebody who gets like 19th place can be having like 20 Facebook notifications, Like, I think that may be a little bit of a spoiler. But anyway, no big deal. We're starting to sort of see Riess for the first time. A little bit of Lindh sort of downfalling as well. Should we get into that hand? Or
part 5 of the Morgenstern collapse is the infamous trip aces against a full house on the flop hand against Mark Newhouse. So again, the same guy he's earlier bluffed off the best hand and then lost a huge flip to. At this point, Newhouse has around 11 million chips or so, and Anton has about 16 million chips, so he still has him covered by a fair amount. Anton with ace-jack, Newhouse calls him the deuces, flop comes ace-ace-deuce, and again, among my favorite lines of this main event by Norm, if Newhouse knew Anton had an ace, he'd be twerking at the table.
That's a good line. So good. And it's so messy. Oh my God.
And then the money goes in on the turn when the 3 peels off. And I guess the real egregious part of, up until the turn, I completely understand Anton Morgenstern's play. The
Mhm.
problem is when Newhouse re-races him on the turn, Morgenstern again can fold and get away from it and only be down maybe like 4 or 5 million for the whole hand, but he has to put in half his stack at that point to call the all in.
Right.
Again, even Newhouse says after Anton loses the hand, "What did you say about this guy?" And I have to wonder what was Morgenstern putting Newhouse on when he made that call.
Yeah, I mean, so Morgenstern leads out on the turn 750. Newhouse makes it 2 million, and then Morgenstern puts in 3.9 million. Newhouse shoves. Morgenstern tanks for a little bit and then calls. I mean, yeah, I mean, you have ace jack. I get that it's trip aces, but I don't know. Is Newhouse going to do that with ace 10, ace 9? I guess so. I don't know. Like,
I don't think so.
I don't think so. Yeah.
I think even if he has ace and ace nine and he thinks he has the best hand, he's not going to go all in because he has to be called by even worse than that. Then on top of that, so
Right.
um, so yeah, I think it's probably a fold. I mean, obviously he had out still, so Anton's probably thinking, I think I had the best hand. If I don't, I still have 7 outs or whatever it is, depending on what Newhouse has
Mhm.
to come from behind and win the hand. But I mean, that's again, it's on avalanching on top of everything that had come before it. I think Anton should recognize, you know what, it's not my night. I'm just going to fold, have 11 million chips, and move on. But he can't do it, and he gets down to about 5 or 6 million chips with that huge loss, and that puts Newhouse into the chip lead.
Right.
And although on theme, to be fair, there's not a chip lead that Newhouse will be able to keep. The chip lead was kind of the cursed spot in leaderboard for day 7, but nonetheless, the rest of the table at this point kind of starts talking, saying like this guy, the overwhelming chip leader, particularly Jay Farber and his rail. They were kind of JC Tran, Farber, and Newhouse, kind of the ones making the most light of the Morgenstern collapse situation.
Yeah, and I mean, give credit where credit's due to Morgenstern. He doesn't seem too upset about it. I mean, he's a pretty stoic guy. I imagine on the inside he must have been reeling. He does go over to his rail at one point and starts speaking to them. I wish they could have translated what he'd said, but he's speaking in German, so we didn't get a good sense of that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a rough hand. I mean, oh my God. You mentioned Newhouse's eyes earlier, but there's this like moment where he's got his eyes closed and he like opens them up like this.
Yeah, exactly. I call it tired eyes, like tired Newhouse eyes. It's just like you're trying to stay awake. You're just, I don't know, maybe he was just really tired. I don't know. It was a weird kind of
Yeah.
thing there. But and surprisingly, so often we would see like the next hand as the episode concludes is Morgenstern's bust out hand. But in fairness to the edit, they will reserve that for the next episode. But this
Mhm.
episode kind of begins the signs of Alexander's maybe over-ambitious strategy on day 7. He ends up playing Jack 9, attempt to bust somebody. Now he lucks out this time. It's a coin flip pre-flop essentially, but it was just as we're seeing Lynn and Morgenstern fall, it was the start of what would come for Alexander heading into episode number 20.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that it was a strategy. I mean, yeah, it definitely felt like he was trying to just end the night. Trying to just take whatever hands he could and just try to end the night. I mean, maybe he figured, okay, I'm an amateur. I can't really beat these guys. I got to just try to, win flips or whatever. But he had a decent sized stack. I mean, as we mentioned at the end of the previous episode, he had 13.2 million chips. That's good. That's plenty to play with.
He was at like 16 million at one point.
Yeah, I mean, he could have just waited his turn like Farber did. Farber found his spots and managed to chip up. It's just it's heartbreaking to see that. I mean, Alexander is an interesting character in that there's parts of him that are admirable, that he's sort of more talkative, more of a casual guy. But then you get stuff like the Mortensen hand. There's stuff where he's just a little too snippy, a little too sort of maybe full of himself. We get a segment from him in this episode talking about his bar, which is called the Flying Walrus, which is an interesting name. You kind of like the guy and you're kind of rooting for him. On the other hand, when he plays like this, it's hard to really root for him, truly.
Yeah, it's true. And again, as we said, this episode begins with 21 players, and it ends with the same number of players. And I really appreciated. I didn't feel the need to kind of throw in Max Coleman's bust out, out of order or something. They really kind of let us see these crazy chip lead collapses it really makes this episode stand out as one of the best of the 2013 main events.
Yep.
Even though it's not viral, because you'd have to have watched the main event up until this point to fully appreciate this episode.
Yeah.
And ironically, on the PokerGo YouTube channel, top 5 hands of the 2013 main event, they actually have 2 of the 5 Anton Morgenstern hands in their top 5. The Ace-7, Ace-Jack, Deuce-Deuce hand. And for some reason, the 8-7 against Loose Lee hand is in there. I really don't think you need to have both hands in there. I think it's pretty silly. There are other hands I think are far more worthy of that. But again, that's their right to make whatever awful list they want to do.
Of course, yeah.
And so heading into the back half of the main event, day 7, and as you'll notice, unlike past main events, where they try to evenly have the same number of episodes covering the final 3 tables as the final 2 tables, we get a 4-2 split.
Yeah.
Because the action was a bit more chaotic when there were 3 tables left. Again, if all these big chip leaders giving away their chips by the shovelful.
Yeah. Yeah, and we, we mentioned how Alexander started to fall in the previous episode. Now we're going to see the fall. Right off the bat, ace deuce against aces.
He has, again, he's had this habit. He would get an ace, raise it up, get probably 3-bet all in by a, middling stack. And he just kind of got sick of being, having a fold, and he was just trying to, I guess, speed things up, and he wasn't really paying attention to the pay jumps, I guess. But considering there were 21 left, you're getting pretty close to that final 2 tables with a nice, pay jump when there's that 19th down to 18th, juncture. And it's very much a sequel to the final hand of the last episode, because he not only does the ace deuce once, he tries the ace deuce twice. And once the cards go on their back, when he raises with the ace, calls off against Rep Porter's shove of the 2 9s, his brother kind of pulls him aside like, you come over here, we're going to emergency coaching situation. After you win this one, stop raising right, because they're just going to keep trying to double up against you. And he has, Alexander seems to have a very loose grasp of what the poker term a race means. Like, he just seems to think that, all in on the flop is a race, when that really is supposed to mean a coin flip. And ace deuce against 9s and a coin flip, son.
It's not a coin flip. No, you're like 30%.
And then, so naturally, when he flops an ace, he says, about time I won a race.
And his brother's talking to him, palling around, you're going to win these chips and all that. And Porter, with his pocket 9s, river magic again. He rivers the 9, and his brother just mid-sentence just stops talking. It's so
great of Alexander's face. He's like, and he loses, by virtue of losing those 3 straight all-in hands, he had lost, more than half its chips. So again, a top 5 stack, bouncing way down on the leaderboard. But, again, not to outdo Alexander's collapse, we get the finishing touches of the Morgenstern collapse, where he ends up first doubling up Fabian Ortiz when his king-queen outflops Morgenstern's ace-king. And then finally, when he's left with just a few stacks of the orange and green chips, all the blue chips for Gonzo, he shoves his ace-jack in with 12 blinds into pocket aces, of course.
Yep, and he busts in 20th place. And Farber's rail, like, nobody can believe it. Farber's off with his rail, talking like, he was the overwhelming chip leader. He had all the chips. And it's kind of a sad ending, because they don't give him a bust-down interview. There's no real dwelling on it. Morgenstern just leaves, and that's it. Like, we're just done, which makes it even just sadder to me.
Mm-hmm. And by this time, though, the actual chip lead was kind of swapping hands. Newhouse was kind of trending down, kind of playing Newhouse poker, not afraid to put money in the pot. But then, of course, he's going to sometimes not have the best hand. And not much happening on table 2 for my taste, really. This is really mostly about the collapse of Alexander and Morgenstern. Yeah. And again, I think we might be underselling it here. You had 2 top 3 stacks with 21 players left, and they're gone in 19th and 20th. That is just to those normal poker viewers, that's not going to mean much. But to anyone that knows kind of ICM and the math of poker, that is wild. Absolutely crazy.
it's lighting money on fire. I mean, maybe Alexander doesn't make the final table, but maybe he gets 12th or something. Like, he's going to go on a deep run with that chip stack so much of the time. So to see him go out, he doesn't even survive the second half of the day. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yes, and so again, with the conclusion of the final three tables, they combine those three tables into two tables with 18 players left. So for the final two parts of day 7, it's a bit more sped up than the more luxurious pacing with trying to cover the entirety of the fall of Anton Morgenstern.
Yeah.
Table 1, we have Sylvain Lewis-Lee, who had jumped into the chip lead at this point. Bruno Kalwau, Trev Porter, Mortensen, Benefield, Ryan Riess, Newhouse, Livingston, and Brimmelhouse are on table 1. Newhouse actually joins halfway into the episode of table 2 because of the bust out order. And JC Tran, Ortiz, Farber, Matt Reed, Nakladel, Mark Etienne McLaughlin, Lehavote, Lynn, and Castelluccio at table 2 start off this second half. And again, the blind is getting up there, 120 and 240K. Rep Porter, again, is actually, this is kind of probably his best spotlight episode because he not only avoids going broke with Kings against Brummelhouse, he once again continues the Rep Porter 2-outer special continues there. And it's impressive stuff how many 2-outers a guy can hit in, on the cameras, in the big screen, in the main event. This deep it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to make it sound, Rep Porter's a very impressive player, gets a lot of respect from other players. You obviously have to be doing something right to make the final two tables of the main event. But yeah, definitely his edit is how just insanely lucky he gets. They even give him a montage of all the 2-outs he hits, all the lucky rivers he hits, and even he acknowledges that he got lucky. So give credit where credit's due. But I mean, yeah, this is definitely his sort of spotlight episode. He's given sort of the focus toward the beginning of the episode. But man, what a lucky guy.
The funny thing about this episode is that it highlights how important the chip distribution really is in the main event, because table 1 had far fewer chips at it than table 2. I think at one point they said they had like 7 below average stacks on table 1 or something like that. And the majority of the bust outs come from table 2, the table that has more chips, which just shows you when you have a few super stacks and then the big ones on the same table, those short stacks are really going to run into trouble. I think none better emphasized than by one of the more bizarre bust outs by Fabian Ortiz, where he kind of bluffs all in on the river and kind of just like swivel chair maneuver where he's just kind of like, whatever, call me, don't call me. And Tran makes a great hero call to bust out Fabian Ortiz, but you have to wonder, I don't think the swivel chair method really shows off on his strength in your hand. I think that was a mistake by Ortiz.
Yeah, it looks like a little kid who has to go pee and he can't get out of the seat. Just looks very odd. And Ortiz just gets up as soon as Tran calls. Like, there's no hesitation. It's a very odd play. Yeah, I mean, we don't really see too many river bluff bust outs.
That's a pretty rare permutation of things. And earlier you said how 9 million was good for like 9th place at one point. At one point, given how bizarre the chip flow had gone, 6.2 million was at one point 9th place in chips on the leaderboard.
Crazy.
So again, that's 1/3 of the chip average of the final table. So you can imagine the standard deviation of the top stacks and the bottom stacks. There's a great gap between them, and it really makes for some interesting table dynamics when you look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely interesting. I mean, they're not really playing tight. I mean, we see sort of more premium hands in the coverage, but it seems like people are willing to mix up. I mean, Benefield shoves the pocket threes into Kawadi's ace queen. Livingston manages, Livingston calls off Riess's raise with ace queen of hearts versus Riess's aces. It's just sort of interesting to see people being willing to mix it up a little bit
more. I totally agree. And, this is kind of the episode where you kind of see the rise of Loosely and Lehavote in the chip standings. They'd kind of been among the less focused on players. I mean, we had seen a bit of Lehavote. Obviously, the interview about chess was shown, but since there's not a ton of table talk, really. I mean, there's a little bit. Farber definitely emphasizes that a little bit more than other players, but again, it's some pretty solid poker. Nothing viral, but again, when in the penultimate episode before the bubble of the final table, especially since they have to cram in 6 eliminations in this one episode.
Mhm.
It comes across better than it could have, than it might have been in other situations.
Yeah, I mean, they do a pretty steady clip of bust outs. Nobody gets, too much credit. Lindh busts in 16th place with 10-9 of spades versus ace-9. As I mentioned, there's not too much sort of emphasis, that dwells on Lindh being a chip leader who busts. 16th place is respectable, but still probably disappointing for him. I would have liked to have heard a little bit more from him, especially because he was one of the more vocal players. What that experience must have been like. Just him talking about his main event. What was his main event like for him? What's he going to take away from this? Add a little bit more to his personality, and it's mainly sort of more of a bust out episode than we've seen in the previous couple of episodes. Which again is fine. You have to show all these bust outs. You have to get to the final table, but I would have liked a little bit more of breathing room for these guys' personalities.
I'm with you there, but it does at least get us to a manageable number of bust outs for the final episode before the final table.
Mm-hmm.
Number 22 gets us from 12 players down to 9. Again, still at 2 tables for the first 2/3 of the episode before going down to 1 table. Matt Reed kind of gets the short end of the stick in this episode because he was kind of a pretty solid chip stack player for the majority of the 7. And he makes it to the final 12. You would think that you might give him a bit more screen time or focus, and he kind of gets, a pretty awful edit because we don't really see him chip down at all. And so he does bust out in, I think, 11th place. We don't really get to feel like we saw him go from point A to point B, which is a bit of a letdown. Rhett Porter does meet his end in 12th place here. He loses a flip to Ryan Riess. Riess willing to flip in a pretty good chunk of his stack, but with that win, he kind of definitely hits a comfortable chip stack going forward as the players dwindle.
Mm-hmm.
On Luce Lee, I didn't realize he only had 34 million in the chip lead at one point, and he only actually makes to the final 9 of a little over half of that. So clearly he had some struggles going forward. But it always seems like the player that bubbles in 10th place is a guy I'm rooting for, and Morgenstern is no exception. I kind of feel like, he gets a good chunk of focus as he, chips down, losing a hand here, losing a hand there. It seems like much like Alexander, he kind of had the wrong strategy, the wrong approach for his play in that sort of hour, 2 hours block of time. I think that he didn't have enough chips to play the style that he wanted to play, and it shows when he goes from kind of that 7th, 8th place stack down to the very bottom before he busts out.
Yeah, I mean, he, loses a few hands here or there. Even Norm says he's not really playing as well as he could have. Doesn't seem too nervous, so it's not like he's tilting or anything. I just think he misread these other players. Probably just thought he could get away with a couple of things that, he didn't wind up getting away with. I mean, in terms of the final table bubble, it's actually one of the longer final table bubbles we see in the coverage. We actually managed to get quite a few hands and a little bit of, table talk, a little bit sort of understanding of who the players are. Newhouse saying that he thinks the money is more important than the bracelet and the attention. Keep in mind he had won this big poker tournament when he was 21 years old, had already won $1.5 million from that tournament. So, he knows about, what it's like to win a tournament, and he's talking more about the money, which is interesting. Yeah, I mean, he just seemed to have been handcuffed by a smaller stack, not really knowing the other players that well. Ultimately, Riess is the one, not Riess, but Tran is the one to do him in with 8-7 against ace-9. Morgenstern calling it off with a flush draw and a second pair, and he just doesn't get there.
Yeah, so it's funny because the actual bubble took 20 hands, and it actually takes up about 18 minutes of the episode. And we got a good number of hands. Most of them have to do with Morgenstern in them. Mark Newhouse began the super short stack of 2.2 million. Morgenstern was in 8th place out of 10 players on the bubble. Newhouse, again, he went from bottom to top, back to bottom, and still at the bottom of the pile of the pack, but manages to hang in there and chip up a little bit. I think that, again, it's not quite as painful as the Elizabeth Hill Gil Bowman ending in 2012, but it's definitely kind of crushing to not at least have one main event past champion at the final table. Like Scotty Nguyen, it would be nice to have somebody in there. But considering how poorly Morgenstern kind of ended the day 7, he kind of deserved it to bust out the way he played there.
I suppose so. I mean,
They
it would
had
have
like
still been
13
nice.
big blinds, you min raises of ace nine, and then it's just a weird way of playing ace nine.
It is a weird play.
Against
Yeah.
chip leader JC Tran, nonetheless, too. I mean, it's one thing if it's someone with fewer chips than the chip leader has. He has got 30 something million chips. He can afford to call 400,000, 800,000 here and there.
Yeah.
And then, some of the bits, they show a bit of Ryan Reiss's family life in Michigan, one which they oddly enough will recycle for the final table, like
Yeah.
bit for bit. I thought I was like, having a Groundhog Day moment or something. I didn't understand why they would use the exact same like 90 seconds a second time.
I
Uh,
guess they assume people wouldn't notice. They did the same thing for Farber too. The nightclub segment where it's him talking about like, yeah, my job is 9 to 5, 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. They'd use the same exact segment for the final episode. I thought that was egregious. I'm like, why can't you just shoot new footage in the months that you're making this?
well, to be fair, that episode was made after the final table, whereas these episodes were made up before the final table actually happened.
Yeah, I know, but you've got time to shoot this footage. I mean, you might as well do it.
Yeah. And then we also have some more side action with Phil Henwick as a burrito maker, which is just kind of bizarre burritos of all things to be cooking up for the Vegas players. Kind of bizarre. It was pretty quick though, so not too egregious really.
Yeah, I mean, I do like his line. He says, "I overplayed 2 10s and now I need a job," and he brings a burrito out to Doyle Brunson, and Norm has some line like Doyle Brunson orders a cheese burrito, and Norm says, "We call that a quesadilla where I'm from," or something like that, which I thought was funny. Yeah, Helmuth has an interesting presence. I mean, that we didn't mention this, but in the episode before this, there's this weird moment where he like walks out to the final two tables and he just starts shaking everybody's hands. Like they stopped the progression of the episode to show this. It was very strange, but
It was very strange.
I liked it.
Yeah. And so again, day 7 ends of JC Tran as the chip leader, where he has a little under 1/5 of the total chips in play. So a very solid, not quite as dominant lead as someone like a Darvin Moon or a Duhamel, but
Right.
still, very strong. And again, a lot of very strong stacks in the second through like 6 spots, and then you have a couple of short stacks. David Benefield, who again made a few kind of too loose calls on day 7 to really, for my taste, he could have maybe had a good 10 or 12 million instead of the 6.4 million heading into the final table, but nonetheless that happened. Newhouse, again, the full span of first to last to up and down ends with a little over 18 big blinds, nothing in 8th place, and then obviously Ryan Reiss and Farber right in the middle there, almost identical stacks, which is again kind of amusing considering how the final 9 will play out.
Right. Isn't that funny?
And then we've talked before about getting a sense of how well do we know the final 9. And it's weird because it definitely felt like there was a decreased emphasis on sort of spotlighting players and the ways we like to have them, be spotlighted. So we got a splash of everybody poker-wise and a little bit off the table-wise. But I think as far as knowing very well versus not at all, I think JC Tran probably number 1 spot there, and then Farber maybe number 2. Maybe you disagree, but.
No, I'm with you. That Tran, we get a sense that he's a family man, very well-respected player. He's the only multiple bracelet winner at the table. Farber, he's the amateur. He's the one that's, the edit is building as the amateur. He has this sort of interesting career. They both seem like nice guys. All 9 of these guys seem like nice guys. But just in terms of understanding their personality and frankly, just the charisma of these guys, I'd say this is the worst table out of the ones that we've seen thus far. I mean, nobody's a super catchy personality to me. We don't have a Bob Bunara type character who's sort of more personable and sort of funny than the rest. No offense to Ryan Reiss. I'm not trying to be mean to him. He played fairly well up till this point, but we just really don't know him as a personality. Okay, he's 23 years old. This is his first main event. He's from Michigan. He went to Catholic school. He's just not that personable or charismatic of a guy. So we really just don't get much of his personality. He's a little arrogant. I mean, he says he's going to win. He's the best player at the table. Okay, there's that. But, I mean, he's the least personable main event winner, I think, of the ones we've seen thus far. And just the table as a whole, I mean, there's really nobody to speak of. I mean, I kept confusing loosely with Leia Vogt, frankly. Like, I just kept mixing the two of them up in my notes. Brummelhouse doesn't really do anything. Benefield, we keep being told, is this big, online phenom, and now he's like a renaissance man, but we don't really see him make too many great, impressive plays. He doesn't have too many chips to work with. So on the whole, and Newhouse becomes a bigger character next year, but, for now, we don't really have that much about him. Yeah, I mean, I'd say just on the whole, nobody's that impressive personally, and we just don't have a good sense of charisma or humor.
They kind of blur together a little bit. I think that's the thing. I feel like we know all of them kind of the same amounts, more or less, and they're all kind of in that same age range as each other. It's not like one super youngster and one 60, 70-year-old guy like a Newville or a Bloomfield. Nobody like that.
Yeah,
I think Jay Strand, was kind of my favorite, my pick to win.
Yeah.
Not just because he was a chip leader, but also because I think he played very well. We saw him play, from days, 6, 7, just some very solid poker. And again, the actual chip distribution, I mean, it's a kind of a cliche, a chip leader, second stack pretty strong, then a couple of pretty short stacks. Nothing too creative as far as a unique sort of distribution of chips for the final 9.
Yeah, so, really nothing.
But again, that's okay. It's not the end of the world if that's the case. It's just that when you're looking back on these main events, you're trying to find anything that stands out, and this definitely kind of lacks that, that Darvin Moon, that Phil Ivey at the table. You don't have that sort of, wow factor. So I think it's a fair point to make there.
Yeah, I mean, they're trying to sell stories here. They're not just trying to accurately capture, what the tournament was like. They want to actually show some of these guys' personalities, have an emotional angle to it. And again, all these guys played fairly well. We didn't mention that, Riess versus, I think it was Mark Ante and McLaughlin, both of them with ace-queen on the final table bubble. Riess manages to get Mark Ante and McLaughlin, who's a very aggressive player, to fold. That's a pretty good play. I mean, he was able to read the situation and execute that play. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of that emotional element, I'm just not feeling it with any of these guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I hear you there. But as we get to the final table, this was the very first final table I watched any part of live. And so that was a big deal. I was not, they broke it into 2 days, the final 9 playing down the heads up, and then the heads up, obviously, playing him on the second day. And I guess I won't dwell too much on how I felt the live version was, because it's not really watchable at this point anywhere online. But I really enjoyed the first couple of hours of play. You saw both of the 2 short stacks doubling up from behind to start off. Yeah. That's always very exciting. Only one of those 2 was actually shown in the episodic version of the final table broadcast. But Newhouse, very early on, hand number 5, doubles up with queens against kings against Mark Ante and McLaughlin. Gives Newhouse a fairly playable stack. I mean, nothing too crazy. 14 million, but 35 big blinds, still playable. He does end up playing a couple of hands, kind of blinding down from there before busting out in 9th place in a flip to Ryan Riess. But nonetheless, he at least got to make a show of it, of sorts. Benefield gets involved in a couple of big hands early on. A couple of them are shown in the broadcast version. And the theme of the first couple of orbits was huge laydowns made correctly. Ace King, Ace Queen folding correctly. 10s by Benefield folding correctly to Brummelhouse. It is a very entertaining for someone like me who was just getting back into the poker watching spirit.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that those are exciting hands, and I wasn't able to see the coverage of it live, but I was able to go back and read the hand histories and so on. Yeah, I mean, pretty good play, but in terms of what we see in the episode, we really don't get that much. It's mainly a bust-out episode where we just sort of see bust-out hand after bust-out hand after bust-out hand. A couple little segments here and there where we get to see a little bit more of these guys' personalities, but I mean, I'm a little let down with this episode, frankly.
I actually kind of liked it. I thought it was better than I thought it was going to be, because when I realized it was going to cover 7 bust outs, I thought it was going to be too much to kind of have. But I thought that they had a fair, considering what I knew from the live version of the final table. I thought that they really got the good non-bust out hands in there. Things like the Newhouse double up, things like the Mark Ante McLaughlin merely a vote hand where Lehavut of 3 kings loses to Mem, as I call him, with a full house. So they had the hands I think that they absolutely had to put in there, so that worked for me.
Yeah.
And the only thing I will say is that you didn't really get the sense that it was the rise of Farber and Riess. Just kind of seemed that it just kind of happened coincidentally as the hands were playing out, because they were the
Right.
only two players to actually eliminate any players from the final table. And so that kind of was hidden by the fact that we didn't see really any of JC Tran's downfall, because
Right.
contrary to what you might believe from this edit, he actually held on to the chip lead for the majority of this batch of hands. Like, I think the first phase of the final table took about 171 hands, and he was in the chip lead for, I think, at least half of them. Kind of
Really?
staying in the 35 to 42 million bracket. He kind of never got any hands. He just kind of made it happen, picked up a few pots here and there, lost small, one, small to medium. And that was completely not present in this edit whatsoever. I mean, granted, they're leading into the Ryan Riess, Jay Farber heads up match, so naturally they're going to want to lead you into that narrative by focusing on those two players. But a good number of these hands have nothing to do with Farber or Riess. I think partially to part two's detriment, but also to part one's benefit.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you bring all that up. I mean, again, because I'm not looking at the live coverage and I'm comparing this episode to the live coverage. I'm sort of just viewing the coverage on its own. And yeah, I mean, the narrative just has you believe that Tran kind of just blinded down, didn't really get anything going by his own admission that he was card dead. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more from him. Maybe this could have been an hour-long special where you have an extra 15 minutes of footage where you can really show that, because we just get, we see Tran with ace queen versus Farber's sixes. Tran getting away from that. Okay, I guess that's a good play. I don't know. But we just don't get that much from him. We don't get that much from him. And I really wish that story had been told better, given how much attention they paid to the other chip leaders blowing up. He just sort of doesn't get that.
It did seem like instead of showing any of Tran's narrative, they got a good amount of Mark Etienne McLaughlin's narrative, because he kind of had up and down to final table, and including, again, one of my favorite bits of the whole final table is the Larry Walker, where he would just run into the crowd after he got a walk in the big blind. I thought that was hilarious. And it happened a couple of times during the final table, so they did get a couple of those captured in the edit, so that was kind of cool. But again, I thought this was one of the better part one final table edits we've had, compared to 2012 or 2011. I thought it was a little bit better. Than those were kind of too fast paced for me, whereas this one was a little bit slower, even though it kind of wasn't, but it felt slower in a good way. So that's why I think it was a bit better. And it's for me, because I know what the live side looked like. It's a more it captures what I felt was absolutely necessary. Like if you're gonna, an abridged version of the live table, this was definitely, a solid attempt at doing that.
So speaking of Mark Etienne McLaughlin, would you have folded those kings?
I just wouldn't have re-raised all in. I would have just called that last. I guess, I don't know. It's brutal. It's six-handed, I know. This is after McLaughlin had climbed from last place into third place, because Farber and Riess were destroying the whole table. He was the only one kind of getting any traction. So it's just kind of crazy how that all worked out.
Yeah, I mean, he raised to 1.6 with kings. Farber had the aces, makes it 3.8. McLaughlin then makes it 8.7, and then Farber puts it to 19.4. I mean, is he going to do that with ace king? I don't think so. I think he got a fold there.
I guess. I mean, sometimes you need to fold kings, and that you have to find spots where it makes sense to do so. And against Farber too, it definitely seems like that could have been inappropriate there. And the bust outs came really fast towards the end. Benefield busted in hand number 38, Newhouse in hand number 36, Brimmelhouse in hand number 55, and then Mark Etienne McLaughlin busts over 100 hands later.
Wow!
And then within 14 hands, we lose the last three players, leading into the final heads-up showdown. And by the final heads-up play, Riess was down about 20 million against Farber. So Farber had about a 5-4 chip lead or so. So again, close enough where one medium pot will change things, but still, a good 15 or 16 big blinds in the lead or so. And heads-up play lasted 91 hands. So about 1/3, a little over a third of the full final table. We've seen, heads-up play take a long time, a short time. Final three-handed play take a long time. This was, kind of in the middle there as far as the ratio there. And I didn't actually get to watch the heads up play live. I only saw the first the Final Table live, and it was, again, this was our first time having an episode dedicated entirely to heads up play. Usually we had a splash of Ben Lamb in Final Three play in 2011, for example, or a episode long three-handed play in 2012. But this was a unique spin on things. And what were your thoughts? You said you were kind of down on part one of the Final Table. What are your thoughts on part two?
I like part two a lot better because they slowed it down. I mean, again, the reason why I don't like part one is because, as I mentioned, they didn't really show Tran all that well. We didn't really get a good sense of him winding down. They just didn't give enough time to let sort of hands speak for themselves and let stories speak for themselves. But here we see Farber and Riess, who I think were the two best players of the final, played the best Final Table out of the 9 players, and they actually go back and forth. And we see both of them, each pull off moves of their own. I really like this episode. As you mentioned, it is unique that it is a episode totally dedicated to heads up play, but that really gives times for this to breathe, to let the hands breathe, establish some natural tension within the episode, within the hands, and I think it works.
So it's funny because this episode kind of has a little bit of a roller coaster feel to it, where Riess starts off on top and then Farber wins a little bit back, gets the lead back, then goes way down, then gets a little bit back, and then eventually slides back down. Ryan Riess runs, gets some great cards, some great board runouts, and I think flip the cards around. Farber does the same thing with the hand distribution. Yeah. But and the funny thing is that Farber was kind of happy and the leads, rolling, nightclubbing, all right, let's do this. And then he just becomes more and more frustrated as the day goes on, starts venting to his rail, whining about, I haven't done anything wrong. What can I do? And that definitely adds a novelty factor to this episode, considering, we've seen a lot of heads up play be very short, and even the ones where it was a bit more stretched out, like in 2011. We didn't get quite as much personality from the final two as we got from Farber, kind of whining as his day just kept getting worse and worse. So that was fun. Although a couple of hands I did want to point out. One is the supposed number one hand of 2013 as demarcated by the top 5 hands of Poker Go of 2013. Hand number 204, where there's it's a pot size is pretty big. Like, I'm not saying it's the biggest pot chip-wise of the main event, but I wouldn't call it the best hand of the main event, where Farber has ace-4 against Riess's jacks, and they put in about a third of the total chips in play into the hand. It's not a very exciting hand, though. I was just surprised by why they put that at number 1. I wouldn't put it in the top 10.
Yeah, I mean, they may have just selected that because Riess won it. I don't know. I thought it was a fine hand. I mean, nothing special. It is kind of interesting that as soon as the check comes back to Riess on the river, he immediately knows he's won the hand. He turns around and says, "Let's go." Kind of just goes to show that he has a bit of a sense of self-awareness, knows where he's in the hand. So it's nice for him. Yeah. I don't understand why that's number 1.
Yeah, I think a hand that's actually more worthy of number 1, not for the episodic broadcast version, but because of the hand when it was happening live, was hand number 234, where Ryan Riess hero calls Jay Farber with queen high on the river. There was once a YouTube copy of this live version of this hand on YouTube that's now gone, unfortunately, and it was a fantastic hand because the crowd actually played a role in the outcome of the hand, which normally I wouldn't be happy with, but in this case I was happy with it because Farber had made a huge bluff earlier at the heads-up match, and by then, 30 minutes later, they have access to what the whole cards were, given the delay on the broadcast on ESPN. And so Farber's rail was kind of shouting, and Farber was, after making a bet on the river, was kind of like smiling, like in response to the crowd reaction, and I think that had a huge influence on Riess's decision to make a big call with queen high on the river in that hand. So
yeah, as Fondiari, this was back when they didn't show the whole cards. The whole cards weren't exposed to the commentators. So as Fondiari's talking about it, and they cut to, Farber, he has this smirk on his face. He goes, "Ooh, that's usually a sign of weakness. I don't know, maybe Riess should make the hero call here." And then the cards get revealed after Riess pushes in the chips, and it's just funny to see him with the flush versus queen high. I wish the copy of this was out somewhere. If you can find it, upload it. We'll give you a shout out, all that. Because I love that hand and I love that commentary so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good. That would be number one for me.
Absolutely, and it was a big turning point in the heads-up match because by then Farber was trying to bounce back from his just gradual decline in the heads-up match, and so again, for me, that was my favorite hand of the episode by far.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so again, Ryan Riess ultimately pulls it off. He gets ace king against Farber's queen 5 pre-flop all in. Farber was on about 12 big blinds, so kind of eventually you kind of have to put in a suited queen at some point. And when Farber loses, he runs off to his rail. I haven't played bad at all, I don't think. It's just, and to be fair, I don't think he played bad. It's just heads up. Sometimes you're gonna get the cards, sometimes you're not gonna get the cards. And to Farber's credit, he was mostly composed for the entire time, and he lasted almost 100 hands despite his opponent running like God. And speaking of God, it was kind of weird to see Riess thank God for the win when I'm not sure if gambling is the most noble thing that God is putting his energy into helping people with. But nonetheless, good for you, Riess, for thanking God for that win.
Yeah, I mean, just the dichotomy between Riess. I mentioned they didn't have much personality, but it was very sweet to see him just kneeling down on the verge of tears. He clearly just cares so much about winning. And it cuts to Jay Farber, and he's just, he's talking to his rail. He just goes, I don't really care, I don't, he kept getting hit by the deck. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. Yeah. And there was one very awkward moment during the bracelet presentation where, Jay Farber is up with Ryan Riess, and Ryan Riess gets the bracelet from Greg Merson, and he's holding it up, and it cut back to Farber for whatever reason as he's holding as Ryan Riess is holding the bracelet up, and Farber's just standing there, and he has this blank expression on his face. I thought that was a very weird editing decision, but props to Farber for not screaming. He does walk over to Riess and give him a hug, and I think said you're so lucky, but whatever.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, I know he handled it better than say Tony Miles did, so I'll give him credit for that also.
Indeed.
I think it's among the best heads up content we've had. It might maybe not as good as 2011. It's definitely in there for my favorite, as far as my favorite heads up play for the final two. It's number 1 and number 2. Although to be fair, I had the whole episode to kind of do that, so it might be an unfair comparison, but it's very high quality entertainment. Heads up sometimes kind of boring, so this definitely was a step up from some of the lackluster final 2 play we've had in other main events like 2010 or even 2008, stuff like that. Not so great.
I mean, 2007, it was just Jerry Yang busting Tuan Lam, and that was it. I mean, I'm really glad that they actually just showed a little bit of it and got a sense. Riess played heads up. Yes, he got hit by the deck, but he won this. He deserved to win it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that concludes the 2013 main event. Again, we'll agree, definitely a better batting average than the first half of the main event. I still don't think it makes up for the first half, really. I think, again, we had kind of a lot of B- to B episodes, even in the back half, that, again, are fine, with the exception of maybe Anton Morgenstern's collapse. If you took out Morgenstern's collapse, you'd still have obviously Lindh's collapse and Alexander's collapse, but if you took out that Morgenstern storyline, I think you really would have a pretty weak overall main event.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like a C for this overall. I mean, Morgenstern's collapse brings it up a couple levels for me. As I mentioned, that's just one of my favorite moments in the history of the main event. Just how they let that carry out over several hands, 2 episodes even, really give that time to settle in. But yeah, I mean, overall, I'm disappointed in terms of how the final table was characterized. I'm disappointed just, none of the segments really, the side action was fine.
It was okay. I thought it was fine. I mean, I think it was better than a lot of other stuff we've had before. I love the skeleton of this main event. I love the song, the music, and some of the edits are pretty good. The way they incorporated some of the bits with the episode were good. I like I still like this live feel of the main event compared to some of the other classic main events. But again, it's weak, and to be fair to ESPN, they might have sensed that because they will again evolve the main event formula as we get to 2014. Again, we mentioned before that we'll no longer be seeing day 3 coverage. They advanced things up to day 4, and that will lead to a shorter main event. a tighter main event. So I guess we'll see if it's a better main event. But again, a lot of characters will carry over into 2014. So this still serves a useful role in poker main event ESPN history. But unfortunately, again, one of these has to be our least favorite, right? So someone has to take one for the team.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said before that 04, I think, was the weakest one out of the ones that, we used to sort of rank them in order. I'd say that this is weaker than 04. I think this is the worst one of the ones we've seen. Just nothing
04 had a novelty to it that this one does not have.
Yeah.
04 has its problems, but it does have, it did sort of perfect the formula that 03 has sort of picked up on. This one doesn't really take the 2011, 2012 structure, and besides some music that, again, we both like, that doesn't really elevate things beyond that. But again, these players are all, most of them are very nice guys. They played some poker. And again, and at the time watching it live on ESPN, very enjoyable. But again, just in this retrospective look, it's, a little bit of a letdown. But that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that you're not meant to binge this content like we're doing, watching one episode per night. Or I watched, frankly, 3 episodes in a row trying to watch all of Morgenstern in one sitting. It's clear you're not supposed to do that. So if you're going back through poker, go and watching this, give yourself a break between a few episodes and sort of just let this space out a little bit.
Yeah. And we had talked about before, should we cover the 2014 one drop, because that was 6 episodes long. So you throw that into the main event, that gets to the same episode count as 2013. I think we'll skip it for now. We might come back to the one drops later on, but we'll go full steam ahead into 2014. Again, kind of in that nostalgic, me getting back into the swing of things, watching poker on ESPN. Any final thoughts you have on this main event before we sign off?
It's just a shame that we never saw that Mark Newhouse guy ever again. I wonder what happened to him.
Maybe he went to some Franciscan monastery or something. I don't know, but
I mean, you do mention how 2014, it does have a lot of characters from 2013, not just Newhouse, but we'll be seeing some other faces as well. I did mention previously how 2013 was sort of the 10th anniversary special of it. There's sort of this is the last hurrah of a lot of old players we're going to see. So it's just kind of interesting how the coverage evolves going forward. It'll be interesting to track.
Mm-hmm. And, I recently finished Mike Matusow's book, Check Raising the Devil, what you gifted me for Christmas. And I thought it was a great read. It definitely had some relevance to some of our talks about the 04, 05, 08 main events. Mikey, if you're listening to this, I thought it was a very solid book. I enjoyed reading it. I recommend it to our listeners to check it out if you ever see it on Amazon or something like that. And looking forward to if Mike has another book, I'd be happy to read that up there. A little poker book club going on. But
didn't he say he was going to write a book, Poker, Pain, and Politics, How All Three May Be a Better Person or something?
Oh, I think you're right. Maybe we'll have to look that up or something. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, and sorry about us. It wasn't me recording you at the main event earlier this year, but if you want us to take that video down, or if you want us to come on to your podcast and apologize, we'll do that. Sorry, buddy.
The mouthpiece and the 2 Fish at the Table podcast scoring off. I love it. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Anyway, enough side shot. We'll see you guys next time at the 2 Fish at the Table for 2014, the main event, with the unprecedented 10 million even top prize, second biggest in main event history. I'm looking forward to covering that shortened main event. We'll see if maybe a slightly shorter structure of the main event will amplify the entertainment value of those episodes. I'm one of your hosts, Legend Ben, signing off.
And I'm one of your other hosts, East Coast Sam. Take care. Don't become Anton Morgenstern 2.0.
Bye, guys.